7th of October, the Shoah, and the Denial of Continuity, with Matthias Ku. Renowned researchers such as Omer Bartov and Christopher R. Browning, and well-known authors such as Michael Rothberg and A. Dirk Moses, issued an open letter on the misuse of Holocaust memory. Here they voiced their opposition not only to abuses of the memory of the Holocaust, which do exist and deserve criticism, but also to any reference to Nazism and the Holocaust in efforts to understand the roots of the 7th of October massacre. In their view, such, quote, comparisons of the crisis unfolding in Israel-Palestine to Nazism and the Holocaust are intellectual and moral failings. Matthias Ku disagrees, and he will explain why. He is a German political scientist and historian. His previous books include Jihad and Jew Hatred, Islamism, Nazism and the Roots of 9/11, and in the series on contemporary anti-Semitism published by Routledge, Nazis, Islamic anti-Semitism and the Middle East, the 1948 Arab War against Israel and the aftershocks of World War II. His essays on Islamism, anti-Semitism and Iran have been translated into many languages.
Okay, the recording has begun. It is now my privilege to pass over to Matthias, who will talk to us for somewhere in the region of 30 minutes. We will then take questions and contributions. If you have a question while he's talking and want to put it in the chat, you may do, and of course we'll come to your question. If you want to ask a question in person, then when we get to the Q&A, please do raise your hand. So without further ado, it's my great pleasure to pass over to Matthias to speak to us.
Thank you very much, John, for this introduction, and thank you to the LCSCA for inviting me. This is a great organization which deserves really our support. My English is not good enough to speak freely, so I prepared a paper and divided it into 3 parts. The first part deals with some special features of 10/7, for example, in comparison to the 1973 war. The second part deals with some special features of the global reaction to 10/7, and here especially with the open letter on the misuse of Holocaust memory, which was also signed by renowned Holocaust researchers such as Omer Bartov or Christopher Browning. And at the end, I would like to present suggestions for future Holocaust education. What exactly was new on the 7th of October? What is the difference between this massacre and the 1948 war when 6,000 Israelis were killed, or the 1973 war when another 2,600 were killed, wars in which, unlike October 7, Israel's very existence was at stake? I consider this to be an important question. What was new on October 7 was, first of all, that this was not a regular war, army against army, but rather that armed men went from house to house to murder unarmed civilians by the hundreds with joy and brutality. October 7 was not a war between tanks or between soldiers, but an act of extermination that, for that very reason, evoked memories of the Holocaust. What was new on October 7 was, secondly, the murders were accompanied by religious slogans and the call Allahu Akbar, God is the greatest. In 1948 and 1973, religion played a marginal role. Hamas, in contrast, has explicitly declared a religious war on Israel and the Jews. The Allahu Akbar that the terrorists shouted during the murders means what we are doing just now is not our human work, but we are doing it on behalf of God. Therefore, one must not contradict it Otherwise, one would be contradicting God. This religious embedding gave the massacre absolute legitimacy and justified the proud sense of triumph and the outbursts of joy that accompanied the killings. Thirdly, what was new about October 7 was that the massacre was based on a clearly anti-Semitic program. 10/7 was, of course, not a new Holocaust, and Hamas is surely not the equivalent of the Nazi Party. In the still valid Hamas Charter of 1988, however, we find a hatred of Jews that, I quote, sounds as if it were copied directly from the page of Der Stürmer, as the Palestinian politician Zari Nussaibi aptly observed. In this document, the Jews are declared to be the global enemy who not only control all media in the United Nations. What is more, just like the Nazis, the Charter claims that the Jews were behind not only the First World War, but also the Second World War. These are, of course, claims that have nothing to do with the Middle East conflict. And just as Adolf Hitler did in Mein Kampf, the Charter cites the so-called Protocols of the Elders of Zion as evidence of Jewish behavior and declares at the same time in Article 7 in religious terms that, quote, the time of the resurrection will not come before the Muslims fight the Jews and kill them, end quote. This charter thus combines the Jew hatred of early Islamic sources with Nazi-style anti-Semitism. This combination created the ideology that caused 10/7. The charter's wording, however, is not the only connection between 10/7 and the Shoah. There are, for example, people in the Islamist milieu who openly announce that the murder of 6 million Jews was a brilliant achievement that should be repeated. A prominent example is the preacher Yusuf al-Qaradawi, who died in 2022. At the time, he was the most important and most popular leader of the Muslim Brotherhood, the organization whose Palestinian branch Hamas considers itself to be. These are the words of al-Qaradawi shouted out to the millions of viewers of the TV channel Al Jazeera in early 2009. I quote, "Throughout history, Allah has imposed upon the Jews people who would punish them for their corruption. The last punishment was carried out by Hitler. He managed to put them in their place. This was divine punishment for them. Allah willing, the next time will be at the hand of the believers," end quote. So in all seriousness, Qaradawi announced a new Holocaust and the end of Israel as a religious mission and Allah's command. In 2009, virtually no one protested against Qaradawi's statement. A third line of continuity refers to the ideological history of Hamas, the main topic of my most recent book mentioned just by John Strawson. The parent organization of Hamas was and presumably is the Muslim Brotherhood. This group was already receiving Nazi money from Berlin in the 1930s. Nazi agents devoted themselves to educating the Muslim Brotherhood's leadership and organized joint Palestine meetings and training sessions on the Jewish question. Newly discovered archival sources reveal that the highest level of the Nazi leadership took a keen interest in this collaboration between Nazi agents and the Muslim Brotherhood, quote, and likewise Goebbels had spoken about it with much praise, we read in one of these sources of 1938. As early as 1937, 11 years before the foundation of Israel, a pamphlet entitled Islam and Judaism was published in Arabic that combines the Jew hatred of early Islamic sources with elements of European anti-Semitism. Hajj Amin al-Husseini, the Mufti of Jerusalem, is named as the author. The Nazis were subsequently distributed in the Muslim world in large quantities and different languages. Then, in April 1939, the Nazis began radio broadcasts in Arabic that would disseminate Goebbels' anti-Semitic anti-Zionism in the Arab world on a daily basis until April 1945, 6 whole years. These Arabic programs, documented and analyzed by Jeffrey Herf, were broadcast from the shortwave transmitter in Seesen, a town south of Berlin, and were characterized by two peculiarities. On the one hand, the German radio broadcasters disguised themselves as particular devout friends of Islam. On the other hand, the programs from Berlin were characterized by rapid anti-Semitism. Quote, kill the Jews, burn their property, destroy their business, wipe out these standardly helpers of British imperialism was the message that came, for example, from Berlin in Arabic when Rommel's Panzerarmee Afrika advanced in Cairo in 1942. For the Arab world, this 6-year nightly barrage by the Nazis proved to be a caesura that divides the history of the Middle East into a before and an after. It promoted an exclusively anti-Jewish reading of the Quran. It popularized the anti-Semitic myth of a world conspiracy, and it shaped a genocidal rhetoric against Zionism. Decades later, the seeds sown by the Nazis and Islamists would sprout as the Hamas Charter of 1988 and the massacre of ntzel proves. What we are dealing with is a Jew hatred that the Nazis had started to incite a whole decade before the foundation of Israel. It is a hatred that exploits and radicalizes the anti-Jewish resentment of the early period of Islam and is persistently the cause of, rather than a reaction to, the violence in the Middle East. This hatred is directed against all Jews, even those most strongly committed to reaching an agreement with the Palestinians, as was the case with many of those slaughtered on 7th of October. And it is directed against anything Israel does. Hamas official Ghazi Hamad has clearly stated that massacres like that of 7th of October will be continually repeated until Israel is destroyed. And it is certain that if Israel military forces had not intervened on that day, the Hamas commandos would have gone on killing endlessly. So much for the specifics of the October 7 massacre that distinguish this day from other events such as 1948 or 1973 wars. It was, first of all, not a war, but an act of extermination. Secondly, it was religiously charged. And thirdly, it followed an openly Nazi ideology. But as special as the event itself was, so was the global reaction, and with it begins my second part. As you know, the perpetrators of October 7 had recorded their sadistic excesses on video and circulated them on the net. It was therefore never as easy as after October 7 to spontaneously take sides and act accordingly. It is all the more shocking then that the opposite occurred, that solidarity with the victims of the massacre was not a matter of course, that people did not pause in order to grasp what had happened, but that many began that same day and in many places to celebrate the atrocities of Hamas and blame Israel for them. As Israeli opposition leader Yair Lapid put it, I quote, "People saw Jews being murdered, raped, and imprisoned, and decided that the Jews were to blame. They saw Jews being the victims of a terrorist attack, and that only increased their hatred of Jews," end quote. The initial demonstrations of solidarity with Israel turned almost immediately into campaigns of accusation against Israel, and thus into a reversal of the victim-perpetrator relationship. Almost everywhere, Israel and so the Jews have been blamed for Hamas terrorism. Almost everywhere, the massacre has been interpreted as a response to 56 years of occupation, and Israel deemed directly or indirectly responsible for the war in Gaza. This stance depends on suppression of the facts about the ideological program of Hamas and its inheritance from National Socialism. Anyone who screams out Hamas anti-Semitism has to find another explanation for its terrorism. So the blame is placed on Israel. And if Israel is ultimately to blame, then the logical consequence is that the more terrorism, the greater will be Israel's guilt. Such twisted logic has surely made a major contribution to the fact that the unparalleled anti-Semitic crime of October 7 has been followed by an unparalleled wave of hatred of Israel and anti-Semitism. Those two errors are closely connected. Firstly, Hamas crimes are detached from their ideological sources and thus pardoned or rationalized. And then, secondly, a space is created for the expression of a classic trope of modern anti-Semitism, the assertion that Jews are responsible for their own persecution. The dogma that Israel is to blame is based on the dogma that there is no link between the anti-Semitism of Hamas and that of the Nazis. One is a precondition for the other. Regrettably, even prominent Holocaust researchers, professors who really should know better, have ingloriously distinguished themselves by joining in the effort to attribute prime responsibility for the massacre to its victims. A case in point is the open letter on the misuse of Holocaust memory published on the 20th of November 2023 and signed by renowned Holocaust researchers such as Omer, Bartov, and Christopher R. Browning, and other well-known authors such as Michael Rothberg and A. Dirk Moses. Here, the signatories voice their opposition not only to the abuses of the memory of the Holocaust, which do exist and which, of course, deserve criticism. They voice their opposition to any reference to Nazism and the Holocaust in efforts to understand the roots of the 7 October massacre. In their view, such, I quote, comparisons of the crisis unfolding the Israel-Palestine to Nazism and the Holocaust are intellectual and moral failings, end quote. This open letter do admit that the 7th of October did remind many Jews of the Shoah and of earlier pogroms. At the same time, it vehemently rejects such associations. I quote, appealing to the memory of the Holocaust obscures our understanding of the anti-Semitism Jews face today and dangerously misrepresents the causes of violence in Israel-Palestine, end quote. This key sentence in the open letter is remarkable. It assumes that the anti-Semitism that Jews are facing today has little or nothing to do with the Jew hatred that culminated in the Holocaust. This is, as we have already seen, false. The ideological, historical, and semantic connections that link the anti-Semitism of Hamas to that of the Nazis, and the scholarly literature that presents these connections can now be ignored only if one is desperate to do so. Moreover, anyone who refrains from mentioning these connections makes Israel not only solely responsible for the Jew hatred in the Arab world, but also downplays it by attributing a putatively rational motive to it. The dogma of discontinuity, that is, the thesis that there is no connection between Hitler's hatred of Jews and Islamist hatred of Israel, has contributed and continues to contribute hugely to the widespread refusal to take the radical Jew hatred of the Muslim Brotherhood and Hamas seriously, and thus facilitated the 7th of October massacre. Why is this dogma of discontinuity so widespread and so popular? Because any hint of this connection would undermine the dichotomy between Zionist perfidy on the one hand and innocent Palestinian victimhood on the other, a dichotomy to which especially the left is deeply committed. It is thus no wonder that the open letter of Bartov and others placed the blame for the widespread killing solely on Israel, whose 75-year history is deemed responsible for the spiral of violence, while the Hamas massacre is referred to repeatedly by the euphemism of the current crisis. There is no military solution in Israel-Palestine, it says just a few weeks after October 7, without explaining how Hamas' murderous rampage could have been stopped without the use of military force. Benjamin Netanyahu and his military policy are often criticized, in my opinion, deservedly so. On the other hand, no argument can justify lack of clarity about the real threats to Israel and ignorance of the real ideology of its enemies. Whoever commits these sins of omission is demonizing Israel by giving the impression that the country wantonly desires war. And herein lies the difference between sincere criticism of the Israeli government and the other kind of criticism of Israel that is presently so widespread. In the former case, the special threats to the country are taken into account, while in the latter, this context of Israel's existence is denied or not mentioned. An example of such withholding of evidence is provided by the statement entitled "The Elephant in the Room," published by Bartov and others on the 17th of August 2023, in which criticism is directed solely at the Israeli so-called occupation regime without the slightest reference to Israel's enemies. 49 days after the publication of this statement, which garnered over 2,000 signatories in the space of a week, Hamas shocked the world with its massacre. It was Islamic anti-Semitism that had now revealed itself to be the real elephant in the room, as the factor that no one wants to see, although it affects everything. This specific blind spot has, however, remained in place post-7 October. Almost all the signatories of the elephant statement have said nothing further. On the 8th of December 2023, historians Jeffrey Herf and Norman Goda issued a critique signed by 30 one other scholars that rejects the sweeping accusation of Holocaust abuse made in the open letter on the misuse of Holocaust memory. Herein, Herf, Goda, and others describe the massacre of 7th of October as, I quote, this mass murder of Jews since the Holocaust, and insist that in terms of ideas, there is a Nazi connection to Hamas. They address, quote, the distinctive form of Islamist Jew hatred that emerged in the 1930s with the Muslim Brotherhood, and emphasizes that, quote, this mix of Islamist and European Jew hatred, while not shared by the entire Arab Muslim world, has maintained a shadow over the Middle East as regards the existence of a Jewish state, end quote. They criticize the anti-Zionist thrust of the open letter and conclude by calling for an unflinching gaze at the connections between past and present in the Hamas dictatorship and its actions, end quote. In a brief reply, the signatories of the open letter reject Herf and Goda's critique. Anyone who claims they write that there are certain ideological similarities between National Socialism and Hamas has simply been taken in by the, quote, myth of a Nazi-like Islamic anti-Semitism. A myth? Something that does not really exist? This dismissive attitude is intellectually untenable. Meanwhile, French philosopher Bernard-Henri Lévy, in his new book, Israel Alone, has called the group of historians around Herf and Goda the, quote, new historians, which then gives us at least a glimmer of hope. Most activists and academics, however, do not want to hear about the disturbing reality that via the anti-Semitism of the Middle East, a piece of the Nazi past lives on in the present. And yet, in repudiating any references to the Shoah, Omer, Bartov, and his co-signatories are fleeing from this fact. Since October 7, it is no longer viable to separate Holocaust from the present, and nor can that massacre be understood by anyone who does not understand the Holocaust and the significance of the anti-Semitism that underlay it. And so my last part begins. 7th of October should be another occasion for a scientifically grounded recall of the Holocaust and for opposition to attempts to relativize its historical significance or dismiss such remembrance just as a fig leaf behind which the Israeli government seeks to hide misdeeds. The months following the massacre have exposed a failure on the part of hitherto existing Holocaust education, which too has not wished to find out about the lasting impact of Nazi ideology in the Muslim world. In November 2023, Dani Dayan, chairman of Yad Vashem, admitted this, saying that, quote, we at Yad Vashem are experts on Nazi ideology, but not in the barbarous ideology of Hamas. We have not investigated it, end quote. This should end. If we want to rise to the new challenge, every future Shoah commemoration should be an anti-Semitism commemoration that no longer taboos the genocidal Jew hatred that continues to live on after Auschwitz in the Middle East. At the same time, the struggle against anti-Semitism should always be conducted in such a way as to create a Holocaust awareness that embraces not only the uniqueness of the crime, but also the uniqueness of the hatred that made it possible. Theodor V. Adorno, the philosopher, wrote in 1966, I quote, Hitler has imposed a new categorical imperative on human beings. to organize their thoughts and actions so as to ensure that Auschwitz is not repeated, that nothing like this happens again. Was this categorical imperative flouted on October 7, 2023? Did, despite the vast differences between Auschwitz and the massacre by Hamas, something like this happen again? I leave the answer open. What is certain is that the successful massacre of 7 October encouraged and strengthened, firstly at least, the Islamist forces in the region. Their aim is not a two-state solution, but a second final solution. Under the leadership of the Iranian regime, they are energetically preparing to destroy the Jewish state of Israel, a goal that they explicitly and loudly announced to the whole world. Even Adolf Hitler did not make his intentions so plain. The Iranian Revolutionary Guards boast about how they intend to raze the Zionist regime to the ground in less than 8 minutes. An Iranian television documentary shows simulated attacks on Israel's nuclear power station, the Knesset, and the cultural center of Tel Aviv, while the Supreme Leader Ali Khamenei has declared that by 2040, Israel will no longer exist. A countdown clock in Tehran shows the number of days remaining until this projected end. The Islamists are doing their utmost to ensure that something like Auschwitz really does happen again. Will humanity following the Holocaust and the ntzel massacre fail once more instead of putting a stop to Jew hatred in good time? At the present time, 47% of the world's Jews live in Israel. This means, in the words of Alvin Rosenfeld, that, quote, there will be no Jewish future worthy of the name without the state of Israel, end quote. But it is not only as a haven of safety for Jews that Israel is more important than ever, it has always also been a symbol of otherness and difference. Hamas' counter-concept is fascist homogeneity. Israel is not better than other countries, but its existence is decisive for the future of the world. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much, Matthias, for a very helpful insight into a very difficult and a quite painful contemporary history brought to us in connection with the painful past. And as you were speaking, it was, for me, quite clear that your work has really been quite crucial, and that many scholars and indeed policymakers have perhaps not taken on board sufficiently its contemporary implications. We can now move to questions, and we'll have answers. I see nothing in the chat. I see Daniel Ben-Ami has a question. Would you like to start, Daniel? And then I see we have Vanda has a question as well. So perhaps we could begin with Daniel and then move on to Vanda.
Yeah, thanks a lot, Matthias, for a really interesting talk. I just wondered if you have an explanation for the blindness to anti-Semitism of the kind of people you're talking about. You know, Omer Bartov, Christopher Browning, lots of other very eminent people. I mean, they're not stupid people. They're very well-educated people. I'm sure they don't think of themselves as anti-Semitic, but I'm sure you're right that there is this whole literature. You know, you can just read the Hamas Charter and other things, which shows Hamas is anti-Semitic. So how come they're so blind to it? What is your explanation?
Thank you very much, Daniel Ben-Ami, for this question. I wrote a longer paper with more quotes of Omer Bartov. And in the year 2004, he made an excellent analysis of the Hamas Charter. So he knows about the Nazi connection to the Hamas Charter. He wrote about it, and I quote it in my paper, which will be published soon. And so you are right. They are intelligent. They especially Omer Bartov knows about that issue. What is the reason for this blindness today? I don't know. We have to ask him in person. Maybe it's the kind of going with the fashion. Maybe it's easier in the United States to survive as a good Jew, which means a Jew against Israel, than to block this kind of demagogy and agitation. I'm in every time you have people who are opportunistic and don't like to fight against the flute. And so this might be an answer, but I have no real answer for you. We have to ask, especially Omer Bartov in person.
Thank you. Wanda, you would like to speak next, I think.
I'm unmuted now.
Yes, you are. We can hear you.
Great, thank you. Yes, there's three. Thank you very much. It was very, very interesting listening to you. I haven't read the Quran, but it was brought to my attention that it's mentioned in the Quran 42 times that about the killing of the Jews. This is something that is so extraordinary that but now for me that these people, these extreme Islamists, but because they believe it is the word of God, they need to carry this out. I don't know if you can confirm that, but it's many, many times. That's my first point. The other point is, in the Nazi ideology, it was about racial purity. So even if they could carry out this genocide, surely the Arabs next would be in line. If it's the Nazi ideology, I wonder, is it the same? And my other point, sorry, there is another one though, is the Balfour Declaration was so treacherous in its ambiguity. I'd just like to know what you think.
Okay, so thank you very much for those three questions, Wanda. First of all, the Quran and the Jews. I don't consider the Quran to be an anti-Semitic book, because we have both in the Quran. We have verses in favor of the Jews, called the children of Israel, and we have verses very much against the Jews. And this is the majority of verses against the Jews. But we also have the other verses in favor of. And how can this happen? It happens because the life of Muhammad was contradictory. In the beginning, he was called himself a prophet who, in a way, just wanted to translate the Torah into Arabic. At the beginning, he was an admirer of the Jews, and the first prayer direction was Jerusalem, not Mecca. But then the Jews of Medina didn't like his kind of dealing with religion, and they didn't become followers of Muhammad. So he became very angry, like later on, like later on Martin Luther. It was the same in a way. Luther became also very angry against the Jews after they resisted his kind of approach. And so the same happened with Muhammad, and you can find this in the Quran, that the older parts of the Quran are pro-Jews, and the newer parts of the Quran are very much aggressive against the Jews. And it was interesting when we had the debate on the Abrahamic Accords. You know, some countries changed their behavior vis-a-vis Israel. Suddenly, out of the sudden, some religious persons in the Emirates, for example, found out that in the Quran you have pro-Jewish verses. This was, of course, also a falsification, because you have to say both is in the Quran. It's a question of interpretation. So one side only says it's negative, and the Nazi policy during those years was very successful by interpreting the Quran only in the anti-Semitic way. And they left out, of course, every sign and hint of a pro-Jewish verse in the Quran. And that brings me to your second question, Nazi ideology and the racism. Well, when the Nazis started to agitate Arabs against Jews, they tried to export their racial anti-Semitism in the Arab world. And they failed their aim. It was not possible. The Arabs didn't believe it. It was a failure. So the Nazis at that time changed their method, their tactic, and switched on to say only religion can be open the minds of the Muslims for our message, because Muhammad got rid of the Jews of Medina, Hitler got rid of the Jews of Germany, so Hitler is in a way like Muhammad. So they used the religious argumentation against the Jews and not the racist argumentation, because they failed with that. And the third question with the Balfour, well, ambiguity. Balfour was big luck for the Zionist movement at the time. And there are a lot of reasons why Balfour was done in that way. Sometimes, you know, even in the British government, some people thought that Jews would be almighty, and during the First World War able to keep the United States on the side of the Brits and to change the behavior in Russia. So it was a kind of philo-Semitism. The Jews are almighty, and we have to deal with them in order to win the war. And there are other motives. These were, you know, Christians with a lot of knowledge of the Bible. So they knew a bit about the Jewish history. And so some were really very much committed to the Jewish state in Palestine. And there was a third explanation that the Zionist delegates, Weizmann, were very, very tactically successful. So they invested a lot of time in order also to convince the French part that this is a good thing to build this kind of state in Palestine. And so we have, I mentioned three causes for this Balfour Declaration.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. I have a question in the chat, which is from Jack Bloom from Johannesburg, who says, why is there this resistance to placing a photo of the Mufti of Jerusalem with Hitler in every Holocaust museum, including Yad Vashem? I don't know, Matthias, if you have the answer to that, because obviously you're not responsible for the museums.
I'm not responsible for them. But of course, there is a controversy if you should put the picture of the Mufti of Jerusalem in this kind of museums. Also, Yad Vashem, there was a controversy about that. And well, many people think it would be an insult against the Muslims. I don't think so, because Muslims are not stupid, and they can make a difference between the Mufti's politics and those of other Muslims during that time. The Mufti was a terrorist against everyone who did not obey his orders. He killed so many because they wanted to live in peace with Jews in Palestine. So this was the first terrorist in this kind of policies, and so I'm in favor. I think museums should discuss this period of time also in this respect.
Yes, I think that's a very important question. Perhaps I could ask you a question. I lived in Egypt 30 years ago for a while, and I did notice that on my way in central Cairo, particularly to my favorite cafe, which was Groppi, the famous Groppi, in the bookstores, there would always be a copy of Mein Kampf. And I have to say, I first of all thought this was some curiosity. I then realized that they were quite widespread phenomenon, and that I just wondered what you thought the contemporary situation in the Arab world is, because as Jeffrey Hurst said in the quote which you had from him, it's not necessarily widespread that there is a kind of Nazi anti-Semitism, but certainly since the Arab Spring in 2010-11, and we saw the rise of the Muslim Brotherhood quite dramatically. I wonder if you think, particularly in this part of the 21st century, and perhaps since September the 11th, 2001, if you think there's been a rise in the impact of Nazi anti-Semitism in the Middle East, not just with Hamas, but more generally.
Well, thank you very much, John. First of all, what you experienced in Cairo, I think is very typical and shows that after 1945, there was a double split of the world. We all know the split between communism and capitalism at that time. But there was also a split in the question of historiography. The Arab world was the only part of the world in which Hitler was sometimes hailed as a hero. You don't have this in other parts of the world in the same way. So this was an extraordinary situation in the Arab world. And well, it changed, I think, a bit. I think the Abraham Accords were a surprise for me. I didn't expect that so fastly, that Saudi Arabia, for example, would change the curriculum for schools in order to have a better presentation of Israel and the Jews. And so I don't think that it's a rise of Nazi anti-Semitism in the Arab world at the time being. It's more or less a split within the Arab and Muslim world. And the split is between those who want to normalize relations with Israel and those who want to defeat this kind of policies and destroy Israel. And on the one hand, we have Iran and the Khamenei clique, and on the other hand, we have those forces in the Arab world which try to support the Abraham Accords. And it was no accident that the October 7 attack came directly after Saudi Arabia gave a signal that it would be ready to normalize relations with Israel. So I have the little hope, it's only a hope, it's not, I'm not sure about it, that maybe Islamic anti-Semitism is not in the same way deep-rooted as Christian anti-Semitism, because this anti-Semitic kind of thinking only came 80 years ago or so, while in the Christian tradition, we have 2000 of years. So I'm a bit more hopeful than your question suggests.
That's a very good answer, I have to say, and one which can give us some hope. We have just a few minutes left. I see now we have a question from Richard, which says, why does it appear that the current anti-Jewish anti-Semitism seems to be driven by the educated elite classes, and that also during the Nazi era, so many of the middle and upper echelons were also university educated? That's quite an interesting question. That as someone who has spent over 50 years in education, people often say the way to solve everything is education, and I always say it depends what you're educating people in. Matthias.
Yeah, you're right, of course. Well, it's nothing new. Also in Nazi Germany, also in the Weimar Republic, after the First World War, it were the educated elite people who were mostly anti-Semitic and fighting against the Jews and killing Rathenau and others, Rosa Luxemburg and others. So it was never a question of stupidity, but people who said they would take care of world affairs are very much in the position to become anti-Semites. And so I just can say it shows that we need to change curricula in a good way so as to prevent anti-Semites to teach those lessons to their students. But this is a very topical issue today, because when it comes to Israel, there are so many, I would say, anti-Semitic professors in the Western world that it's a good reason to become desperate, but we shouldn't become desperate.
Thank you. But that is a sort of sobering thought, and you're quite right that obviously those of us in the academic world like yourself know full well that we've experienced, certainly over the last 20 years, not just being cancelled, but being expelled, being shunned, being denounced by people who we once thought of friends and colleagues, people we worked together. Only this year, I was sort of kicked out of a network in the Law and Society Association for not saying that Israel was committing genocide. And I think this is a common experience that many of us are feeling. So it seems to me that one of the lessons of that, the answer to that last question, is that we really do need to develop a strategy of how we change the content of education, and also how we take people who are suspicious of what we're doing with us. We have to find a language of engagement, which I think is extremely important. We have just 1 minute left. I don't know if there's one other last question before we close this absolutely fascinating session. Okay, I think that the reason that there isn't a question, Matthias, an extra question, is because you really have covered the ground so brilliantly, and have, I think, given us all something to think about a lot, which your books also have done, certainly for me. And I think you did teach me that to some extent, I had underestimated the strength of anti-Semitism within the Palestinian national movement. I don't mean for 1 minute to say the Palestinian national movement is anti-Semitic, merely that there's an influence of anti-Semitism which exists in certain stratas, obviously with Hamas, but also there is a the board that we need to take into account, and we need to develop a strategy how to deal with it if we are to get peace in the Middle East. Thank you very much, Matthias, for your paper. Thank you, everyone who came. Sue has just asked a very last-minute question. So just before we go, I'll read out the question, because thank you, Sue, for asking it. She says, I find it intellectually difficult to comprehend that large parts of the left support Hamas, Islamic Jihad, whose whole ethos is authoritarian, right-wing, unprogressive, theocratic. How do we counter this? Well, I don't think we have quite the time to do that, but I will just give a last couple of minutes to Matthias to say what he would like at the end of this discussion.
This is really the tragic. I also can't comprehend those left-wingers. But I can tell you, 40 years ago, 50 years ago, I was one of them. I can tell you a personal story. In the year 1972, there was a terrorist attack at the Munich Olympic Games. And I was 70 years old. It was my 9/11. And at that time, I was searching for an answer to the question, how could this happen? And I saw many left-wing journals. I bought them. I learned by Lenin that terrorism is bad, but it has a social cause. And so it was clear to me the social cause must be Israel's policy. But what I didn't know at that time was that anti-Semitism doesn't need a social cause. There is no cause for the murder of 6 million in the Holocaust. There is for atrocities against Jews after the Ritualmord. What is this? After the blood libel, for example. So I had to learn from the history of the Holocaust that anti-Semitism does not play in this very well-known concept of cause and effect, because there is an effect of killing Jews without a cause that is obvious, that is material, that is really there. And therefore, I had to learn by myself. And when 9/11 happened, 2001, I had learned a lot and saw that the left people, around me didn't learn. They said, again, it must be the policy of the United States that caused this terrible attack, which was an error, a big and a bad error, because it was, of course, the ideology of bin Laden to say that we need a Sharia dictatorship instead of democracies. So it was a principle matter and not a matter of political tactic. And so I had to learn throughout my life, and I was, of course, also kicked out of left communities because of my trying to understand the world better than before.
Thank you so much for that, a very personal reply, which I think also gives us a lot to work on. Well, Matthias, thank you so much for your talk. Thank you to everyone who came. This obviously is part of the series of the London Centre for the Study of Anti-Semitism, its autumn seminar series. The next seminar will be on the 9th of October, and the topic will be anti-Semitism and linguistics, and it will be presented by Yaron Matras. So I look forward to seeing as many of you who can make that talk then. And all I'd like to do now is to thank Matthias so much.
Thank you very much. Bye-bye.